Okay, good evening. So we can start. Okay. Um, the section right now, the second part, discusses theories, the general theoretical approaches to the mm, the issue of economic development. Last week, we had the neoclassical theories of economic development, and we've characterized what they are like, always very mathematical and focused on a few factors, a few variables. The main concern was to ensure that aggregate demand and aggregate supply both shift such that GNI could increase without causing inflationary pressures, okay, because they want to maintain this macro stability. So therefore, they'd like inflation rate to remain low, interest rate to remain low, and exchange rate to be stable. And it focuses a lot as well on the econometric verification of their theories. Okay? And there are very many neoclassical theories that explain the long-term process of economic development, which we went through. The most popular ones, the human capital theory, your research and development, the issue of economies of scale, and the movement of labor from low to high productivity jobs. Okay, so this evening, what I'll now be discussing with you is the second type of theories of the process of economic development. This again is one of the original theories in development economics. It emerged in the late 1950s. And this is a theory of history. Okay. The focus is to look at the histories of the developed economies as of 1950s. And they were the Western European countries and the North American countries. And in this theory, it tried to identify patterns to explain um, why Western Europe and North America became the developed economies, the first developed economies, in fact, at that time, and to see what factors can explain the attainment of developed economy status in these countries, and to see which particular factors may have played a role and whether these factors can be replicated among the developing countries. Okay, and this um, theory is your stages of growth theories. Okay? The stages of growth theories, which its original one was developed by Walt Whitman Rostow in the late 1950s. Okay, his original article identified three stages, but several stages have been added by other authors, so that when it now comes to Todaro's summary, okay, Todaro now extends the stages of growth to include two more, so there are five general stages of growth. Okay, and the focus of the theory is similar to the focus of neoclassical economic analysis, and it is on the generation of savings. Okay, the generation of savings to generate funds for further investment. Okay, savings plays a very, very important role in economic analysis from the very, very beginning. Okay, in the path-breaking work of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Okay, Adam Smith identified the importance of savings as the source of funds needed for further investment to propel economic development in the long run. Okay, what Adam Smith called the rise of opulence. Okay, that's the term that was used in the late 1700s. Opulent nowadays would refer to extravagant luxury, okay, such as um, the opulent mansion of Manny Pacquiao in Forbes Park, for example. Okay, but the way Adam Smith uses the word opulence, he meant it in terms of material abundance, okay? Material abundance in society. And Smith mentions that savings is actually a natural habit of human beings, okay? Now, in one of his more poetic passages in Book 2, he says that it is inherent to all of us human beings. It's the desire for savings, he says, is very, very much with us from the time that we are in the womb until the time that we pass away. It's one of his more famous passages in The Wealth of Nations. So the idea, therefore, of generation of savings, the identification of its source, and how this savings can be expanded over time and utilized for further investment, therefore plays a very central role in nearly all theories of economic development. Okay, so that is what we'll be looking at. Okay, in neoclassical theories, savings equal investment was the macroeconomic equilibrium, and therefore savings played a substantial role in the buildup of capital stock. Okay? And one of the characteristics of developed economies is a very high capital labor ratio. And with savings being a stable function of national income, in order to attain a higher level of growth, okay, uh, it is not at all feasible to try and increase the savings rate because that would mean reducing consumption per capita, which means repressing people's standard of living, making people be forced into a lower standard of living. Therefore, in order to obtain the necessary funds to raise the growth rate by having more investable funds to increase the capital stock of the country. The solo growth model, Harrod-Domar growth model, both focus on the importance of capital inflow from the high capital intensity countries, the developed countries, towards the developing countries. Okay. Now, let's look at how the stages of growth theory analyze analyzes this process of savings and the process of economic development in the long run. Okay. In Rostow's presentation, okay, the stages of growth are the following. There's the traditional society, of which there are two types. The old world society, which is based upon the history of Western Europe, and you have the New World Society that's based upon the history of North America. Okay, they're quite different, but in either society, you do have there the presence of savers. Okay, there would be a class of people that are doing the savings. Okay? And society is able to move to the next stage when this group of people who are doing the savings in society manage to become dominant in the rest of society. So the rest of the society now also begin to focus on savings, just like these original savers once they became the dominant class of people. And in the next stage, okay, an important factor here would be when the savings of society would now be invested in what Rostow calls preconditions being set. Now, in Rostow's theory, you have two different traditional societies, but once societies reach the second stage onwards, they become quite similar. Okay, so let's first discuss what these stages are. So, in preconditions being set, okay, the two important preconditions for further long-term economic development is the setting up of a transport system and the setting up of an elementary education system. Now, the transport system extends the market reach of both firms and households. Okay? When you have a transport system, firms no longer need to produce for just the local market. They're no longer restricted by just the local market. They can expand production further because they can now send their products to other places, given that you now have this transport system put in place. So more and more firms can therefore experience increases in their revenues since they're now able to increase the scale of production operations in order to produce for a larger market. At the same time, with the transport system, firms can now have access to a wider range of inputs. Okay. The transport system, firms can source their inputs looking for the most cost-effective input. Inputs that are low cost and for high quality, which will allow for greater production efficiencies. Okay. So given this combination of greater revenues and lowered costs of production because you now have larger scale operations, given that firms are able to reach a much bigger market. Given this, you now have firms experiencing more and more profits, and therefore firms can now have more funds for further investment. Okay, this is the case where savings of the firms translate directly into further investment. Okay, now the transport system also widens the market reach of households. Okay, when communities now have access to goods coming from uh, so many other places, so there's a greater variety of goods available in the local market. Okay? The idea is that uh, this will act as a spur for household members to work harder and find those jobs that pay well so that they can afford to purchase those wider range of goods. Okay, this factor, which is not much discussed in neoclassical economic theory, but discussed a lot in sociological. Okay? Um, this factor is based on the concept of goods acting as what is called the incentive goods, okay? Or what sociologists call aspirational goods. Okay? The idea here is that households have an incentive at working harder to earn more incomes so that they can purchase more and more of these goods which they desire, okay? And they are incentives, therefore, for hard work and greater incomes. And they're also what's called aspirational. It allows households to attain what they would consider a higher standard of living by the ability to obtain these particular goods. They act as a spur, a stimulus to hard work to earn more to be able to purchase these goods. Okay. At the same time, given a transport system, households now have a wide range of choice of jobs. They no longer need to be limited to the jobs available in the local community. They can now seek jobs elsewhere. Okay? Elsewhere do not need to be too far away. It could be the city nearby, the major city nearby, which still allows them, given that there's a transport system, to be moving back and forth from place of residence to the place of work. So the idea is that with a wider range of choice of jobs, households have every incentive now to find a job and work hard at that job to be able to earn more and therefore afford these incentive goods or aspirational goods. Okay. So the idea would be that given that more and more households are able to earn higher incomes, it would mean that there are now more and more households able to generate savings in addition to being able to afford incentive goods and or aspirational goods. Okay. This is one area of the microeconomics of development that economists often are somewhat oblivious to. It takes a while for them to begin to appreciate that when you're talking about uh, improvement in the standard of living, okay, the income is just an indicator. What really matters would be the ability to purchase the goods and services that would allow for a higher material standard of living. So the higher income by itself is not what is enough. Okay? I mentioned this because I could also repeat this example later when we discuss agriculture and economic development, because sometime in the 1970s, you have the promotion of green revolution technology. This was based upon intensive research from the Institute of Rice, Rice Research Institute, IRI, in Los Baños, that tried to develop uh, highly productive strains of rice, which turned out to have some unintended and unforeseen environmental damage after 4 years. So now they're trying to focus on developing newer technologies that maintain the productivity while lessening the damage to the environment by way of decreasing the role of pesticides and inorganic fertilizers in water. Okay, but that's another issue. The point here is beginning late 1960s, late in 1970s, you have this program in many Asian countries, the Philippines among them. We called it the Masagana 99 program. And the aim was to encourage farmers, rice farmers, to increase the rice output in order to increase domestic supplies of rice and make rice prices affordable to city dwellers. Okay, so that's when the Philippines started what is now known as the National Food Authority, the NFA. And what it did at that time was in order to encourage rice farmers to increase their production, they were given higher and higher support prices. Oftentimes, the support prices would be higher than what the market price would have been. So effectively, it was a subsidy from the government, but it didn't matter initially because the aim really was to give incentives to rice farmers to increase production so there's a greater supply of rice in towns and cities. Okay, and this was done not just in the Philippines but in other countries in Asia, and um, there was really an increase in the level of production, and many rice farmers began to experience improvements in their income and life. However, at some point in time, they noticed that if they kept on increasing prices, output was not changing anymore. It reached the plateau. It's reached the plateau. So they were wondering what has happened. So they began to do research. That's how economists do it. You have a policy, you have a program, and then you understand theoretical outcomes, directions, and the like. And then when your theoretical outcomes are met, then of course there's that feeling of success. But of course, in the long run, you notice that there are some changes happening in the outcome. So you now study again to see how to fine tune policy is. So there were studies among rice farmers throughout Asia to find out why is it that they were no longer increasing production even when support prices for palay kept on going up. And among other things, they found out that the rural rice farmers did experience improvements in their income. But the problem was there wasn't much to buy in many rural markets. So truly, at some point, there was no point in earning more money, more cash, if there wasn't anything much to spend on. And in fact, they noticed that there's a sociological angle here. They noticed that uh, common to all rice households was that rural households was that they were actually aiming at just one particular type of good which happened to be available in their local markets. And once they were able to afford to purchase this, then the incentive for higher production was met. So there no longer was any great incentive to keep on earning more and more money incomes. Okay, they found out in Indonesia, for example, that once they were able to purchase bicycles, then that's it, they were happy. Okay, here in the Philippines, I think they found out that once households were able to purchase sound systems, they call that sound systems at the time, precursors of karaoke systems. Okay, there weren't microphones, but at least they could record music and the like. That was the incentive. Also, there weren't much by way of savings facilities. So though they may earn extra, uh, there weren't systems that allow them open bank accounts so that they can further increase their earnings. Okay, and this is the difference with Japan. When Japan um, uh, was able to generate substantial rural savings from the 1920s and 30s, and this is because they set up postal savings systems, okay, where rural households could open bank accounts located in towns and cities, but they can do their deposits and withdrawals by the postal service. And the postal service is present in many small communities, so there is no need to spend too much time or money to go to the towns in order to do banking transactions. Okay, so this is the importance of not so much just focusing on raising incomes, but also improving markets to make more goods available in those places that would be accessible to households, especially in the rural areas. Okay. So you now have households, more and more households able to earn more, and by earning more, they're able to generate substantial savings. And then you have, which would be very beneficial to society if the savings can be deposited in financial institutions that would allow for more credit for further investment. And then you also have firms able to generate more revenues and realize lower costs of production, therefore generate more profits and therefore more funds for further investment, all made possible by the presence of a transport system. The other important precondition would be the setting up of an elementary education system. From the 1800s onwards, you have more and more elementary education systems being established in Western Europe, in North America. The Philippines also had one. We began sometime 1870 with the Maura Law passed by the government of Spain under Reina Isabel II. Okay, and a public education system was begun in the Philippines in the late 1800s onwards. Okay, elementary education systems would mean being able to teach more and more individuals the basic elements of education: reading, writing, arithmetic. Okay. The importance of the elementary education system would be that the the presence of more and more individuals able to read and write and do basic numerical work, arithmetic, right, translates to greater productivity. And greater productivity would mean higher incomes for the individual and greater profitability for firms, for the employers. Okay, when your labor force is comprised of people who can read and write and do basic uh, arithmetic skills, okay, then they do not need as much monitoring as opposed to those who don't have much of basic education. Okay, because when your labor force is generally literate and educated, okay, um, Monitoring and direction are much simpler because you can issue written instructions and you can expect written feedback and you can expect them to do their basic computations, calculations, and the like. Okay, a lot of modern society is based on this presumption. Okay? You cannot, for example, complete your income tax form if you don't know how to read and write and do, very importantly, do your basic arithmetic so that you can follow the instructions there. Okay. Otherwise, your managers will be spending so much time and money in the monitoring and supervision of many individuals who don't have the necessary literacy and numeracy. Okay. So from the point of view of firms, more and more employees being educated substantially reduces monitoring cost and therefore raises the productivity of the individuals and of the firms. Okay. And at the same time, with individuals, they're able to land jobs that demand greater output and greater productivity, which then translates to uh, higher pay. Okay? So the elementary education system, it would mean greater productivity for firms and therefore more profits and more funds for further investment. And for households, it would then mean access to higher paying jobs and therefore more savings. So put these together with the transport system and the elementary education being put in place, it would translate to more and more firms able to generate more and more profits and therefore have more and more funds for further investment and more households able to earn higher incomes and therefore allow for the generation of savings. Okay, that can be translated into further investments, especially given the presence of a financial system that's able to convert savings deposits into loanable funds for further investment. Okay. So with this, the preconditions set, you now have these societies able to generate substantial savings. And then the next stage is what Rostow calls the takeoff stage. Okay. As I mentioned to you in the last class, this is the late 1950s. Umuuso pa lang noon ng umuuso pa lang noon ang commercial jet travel. At when there's a new technology, that new technology uses certain types of words and terminologies in a very specific sense. Okay? So that if you use these words, you are in many ways trying to communicate that you're now familiar with this technology. You're cool. Okay. Uh, right now, nowadays, for example, there are special meanings attached to words like to boot your system means you know something about computer technology. That's very, very uh, basic. Or if you talk about the avatar, avatar originally was, it's from a Sanskrit word that referred to a generation of a reincarnation of Brahma. It's the avatar. Avatar now has a different meaning, especially for those who are very much in cyber games and the like. Okay, and if you're able to use the word avatar in that sense, then you're able to communicate you're being very much involved in cyber games and the like. So you're cool. And the late 1950s, commercial jet travel was the novel thing. And at that time, only really, really wealthy people and those on paid travel, paid by their employers, could afford commercial jet travel and would know some of the terms used in jet travel. So one of them, of course, is takeoff. Okay, so Rosto used the word takeoff just to show he was cool at the time. Okay, now if you think of the image of a plane, when it takes off, before it takes off, the plane would usually stop and start revving up the machine in order to generate and accumulate power, and then it will gradually start rolling down the runway until it's able to rise up to overcome the force of gravity from the force that it accumulated in the engines. And this is called the takeoff, okay? Being able to reach a higher level. So that was the image that Rostow was saying, that there is a certain phase in the histories of the developed countries such that once they got into this phase and they're able to maintain it for a long enough period of time, they're able to move up away from the low income, high poverty situation that their societies were, and were able to attain higher income, low poverty situations, which was already the case among the Western European and North American countries by the 1950s. And the takeoff, according to Rostow, occurs when the society is able to generate higher and higher incomes such that society is able to save up to 10% of the national income. Okay. And from your macroeconomics, from Keynesian theory, that uh, the higher the level of income, the larger is the proportion on savings. Okay? So with higher incomes, households can enjoy higher levels of consumption, but they're also able to save a bigger and bigger proportion of their incomes. Okay. So takeoff, therefore, occurs when the incomes of the society reach a high enough level such that they're able to save at least 10% of their national income and maintain this for a long enough period of time. So that means the society is able now to automatically generate the necessary savings. And therefore, with these savings, you now have funds for further and regular investment, and therefore allowing for higher economic activity. Okay. Now, subsequent historians, economic historians, and theorists now did further studies and noted that the takeoff is not automatic. Economic development was attained because there were important activities that these societies were able to attain as well. Okay? So two more stages were added. The fourth stage after the takeoff is what's called the drive to maturity. The drive to maturity would be the stage when the industrial sector begins to dominate output, employment, and exports in society. Okay, so it's not just a question of more and more savings being invested. Okay, what guaranteed the attainment of developed economy status was that more and more of the investments were going towards the industrial sector. So that in the fourth stage, the industrial sector was now the dominant sector in terms of its total share in output, employment, and export earnings. Okay? And the idea being that the industrial sector is one sector that has substantial linkages with other sectors in the society. So that the growth of one sector involves and provokes expansion in other sectors because they are linked. Industrial enterprises produce a wide range of goods which are also inputs to other industries, and at the same time they also purchase a wide range of inputs from so many other industries, and therefore industrial expansion, its major linkage with other sectors, is able to generate substantial output and therefore substantial profits, and also generate substantial employment, and therefore allowing more and more households to have greater incomes and therefore greater savings. So this is how society is able to then generate further and further savings as it proceeds. Okay. This is especially important when you begin to consider what happened to many high-income countries but are not industrialized, which are petroleum exporting countries. That's why there's a separate category often for them. They're called the high income non-industrialized economies. The nature and structure of their economy is not that of a developed economy. Okay. There would still be substantial pockets of poverty in many of these countries. Okay. And it's explained by the fact that the industrial sector did not become a major producing sector in their societies, whereas in the developed countries, the dominance of the industrial sector guaranteed further economic expansion. Then, with more and more incomes being earned and greater and greater savings being generated, allowing for more funds for further investment, the Western European and North American countries attained what would be called a developed economy status, and that is the economy that has reached the stage of high mass consumption. Okay. The idea here is that these societies now earn such high levels of income that not only are they able to generate more and more savings, but in addition to the savings, the majority of the population is able to attain a high level of material abundance, a high level of consumption enjoyed by the mass of the population. And many of the economic historians point out that this is what really differentiates developed economies from other civilizations, even ancient civilizations. Okay, a lot of the civilizations in the past, okay, in China, in India, and in Europe. In Europe until the late 1700s or 1800s, they were all able to attain high levels of consumption, but these high levels of consumption were enjoyed by a minority of the population. Okay, what makes developed countries different was that this high level of consumption was enjoyed by the mass of the population, by the majority of the population. And this is the stages of growth definition of a developed economy. An economy that has attained high mass consumption. Okay, so these are the main stages of growth. Okay? And later on, as we shall see, um, the idea of a developed economy being an economy that has a high level of mass consumption would also mean a high level of utilization of natural resources. It does have some implications on the environment, but we will be discussing that later on. Okay, so now we'll be looking at the two different types of traditional societies and how these different types of traditional societies were generating savings. Okay, so we'll have a look. So in the meantime, um, just a minute. If I can take a break for about 5 minutes, okay? So just a minute. Okay, so we can take a break right now. I'll pause the recording. Break for about 5 minutes, okay? Start. Right. So now we look at the traditional societies. The important item to look for again would be to understand the nature of these traditional societies and identify how savings um, emerged in these societies. And this will involve identification of different social classes. Okay. Social class differentiation is not a very, very strong focus of neoclassical economic analysis. It does talk about income classes, okay? But when you talk of social classes, it involves not just differences in income, but even differences in attitudes and behavior that can result in substantial economic changes. For example, you could have some attitudes and behavior that make this large group of people high rates of savers as opposed to another or not major rates of savers. Okay? So we'll be looking here therefore and the important role of social classes. Okay, so let's look first at your traditional society, the first type being your New World Society. And this is based upon the experience of the North American countries, okay, Canada and the United States of America, and also very much Australia and New Zealand. Okay. Now, New World societies are societies with low population densities, and low population densities meant that they were abundant in natural resources, okay? Which is why in the early stages in the 1800s, these countries tended to specialize in the production and export of raw materials and agricultural products. Okay? The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand were major exporters to the European economies. The European economies were the industrializing economies at the time. So Canada and the United States of America were major exporters of cotton, wheat, barley, other grains, tobacco, iron ore, coal, wool, cotton, and the like. Okay? They became major exporters of these. Now, the New World societies were also dominantly immigrant. Okay, they had a large indigenous population. Okay, what used to be called Indians, which in the United States of America, they now call them Native Americans, which the Canadians would call their First Nations. And in Australia, they would call them their Aborigines. Okay. But although these indigenous populations are already there present, the um, dominant members of society, both in terms of their numbers and in terms of their political and economic power and resources, the dominant ones were immigrants, largely migrants from Britain and also other parts of Europe. It's the case in Canada, the United States of America, and Australia. Okay. So they're dominantly immigrants. Now, the important thing to consider here is that being immigrants have been studied and verified as having individually having high rates of savings. Okay. Immigrants have a certain predisposition to material acquisitions as a manifestation of their high rates of savings. Material acquisitions involve not just the purchase of household items and household furnishings, clothing, consumption items, not just that, but also what you might call home investment items, such as the purchase of land, one's own house, farms, and also the purchase of financial assets. Okay. Now, the thing about immigrants is that they have high rates of savings because traditionally immigrants have a certain predisposition to return. There were very, very many immigrants who were hoping and planning on returning to their home countries. And to do that, they've had to work hard and save a lot and invest in order to improve their material standing enough such that they can return. So there's always a very, very high rate of accumulation of wealth among immigrants. Now, it so happens that for the majority of immigrants, many of them do not return, are not able to, somehow they decide to stay on and settle. But that would mean that they've all accumulated substantial wealth that they can pass on to the next generation. And their habits of hard work and thrift and high rates of savings, they could pass on to the next generation. So it is through the dominantly immigrant nature of these societies that savings gets to be generated. Okay? That explains, therefore, the phenomenon of Filipino overseas workers and Philippine expatriate communities having on average higher rates of savings, higher income levels compared to the average Filipino household that remains in the Philippines. Okay, they have high rates of savings and higher incomes per capita because over there they are immigrants. Okay? They behave differently from people who did not migrate, from people who have chosen to remain in their countries of origin. Now, domestic immigrants do show high rates of savings. So within a country, those who migrated from other parts, moving elsewhere, do have this immigrant uh, behavior. And that's why it's noticed that a lot of the immigrant settlers in Mindanao, for example, have higher uh, socioeconomic status compared to the ones who stayed on in their traditional home regions. Okay? It also explains why, for example, Jews would have high rates of material abundance, especially when they were in Europe and in North America, since they were immigrants over there. Then, of course, you have the Chinese in Southeast Asia. On average, they would have very high rates of income and savings compared to the average household that remained in China. So this really is part of the immigrant phenomenon. Okay. Now, um, in New World societies in North America, in Canada and the United States of America, there was not a strong central government from the start, but there were many well-established local governments, which was why to these local governments, the households in North America and the United States of America were paying their taxes, and it's these local governments that set up the transport system and the elementary education system. Also, some of their major transport systems, such as the railway systems, would be begun by private investors. Okay? Private investors. Which is why in the United States of America, one of the earliest billionaire families were the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts were the ones that first invested in the railway systems in North America. Okay. Now, this explains some peculiarities of American society. In the United States of America and in Canada, the educational system is the responsibility of the local government, either the state government or the city or municipal governments. Okay? People pay taxes to them, and then these taxes pay for these school systems. Okay? And this explains why in the United States of America and in Canada, um, going to a public school is not automatically a social status marker. In the Philippines, for example, it is a social status marker, along with the countries in Europe and many other parts of the world, where public schools, or what we call public schools, meaning to say a school owned and established by the government of whatever level, national or local, that public schools tend to cater to children coming from low-income households. So the public schools, they are free or low tuition establishments, which is why low-income families could then send their children to public schools. Okay? And if the public educational system is largely paid for by taxes, and the bulk of taxation comes from the middle and higher income classes, then this is one of the mechanisms for the distribution of income. Okay? Where the incomes being earned by the upper and the middle incomes, the taxes on their incomes pay for education for the lower income households. And if the education is also good quality, but is free and does not charge high tuition, any tuition, or very low tuition levels to low income households, it means that low income households are able to stretch their standard of living because the portion of their income that they could have spent on education, they can now spend on other things because education, good quality education, can now be available for free or low tuition fee. And that's why um, going to public school is a social status marker. And in contrast, going to a private school is a marker of one coming from a high socioeconomic status, high income household, because your family can then afford to pay the tuition fee for your education. This is different in the United States and in Canada. Okay? There are some states where going to the public school is a social status marker, such as in New York. Okay? Definitely public schools in New York. The state and the city of New York cater to uh, the low income households. Okay? The higher income households would be sending their children to private schools. Okay? That's why if you're a fan of television series set in New York City, you'd know, for example, that in Gossip Girl, you have Serena and Blair going to a fictional private school, Constance Academy. Whereas when you watch Law and Order Special Victims Unit set in New York, a lot of the victims there who come from low income households would be going to public school. However, in places like California, there's a different factor. Okay, Beverly Hills is a high income city. It's a city that declared itself independent of the rest of Los Angeles. Okay, um, an analogy here in the Philippines would be, let's say, if Forbes Park, Dasmariñas Village, um, San Lorenzo, Urdaneta, Bel Air, okay, and the BGC, okay, you can imagine that if our law allowed these cities to these villages to declare itself independent of the city of Makati, okay, law in the United States allows for that. So it was the case that Beverly Hills declared itself independent of Los Angeles. And Beverly Hills is a city that is really designed for high income households. Okay, they do not specify an income level. However, the city ordinances mandate a certain minimum lot size. You have to purchase a certain minimum lot size. And the floor area ratio, the area of the floor area of your house, the ground floor of your house, compared to the entire lot area, is kept small. So therefore, effectively, every house there would be at a distance from the next house. They'd be surrounded by a wide lawn with trees and maintain a certain poverty, and therefore the semblance of living out in the country, in the province, far away. The residential units in Forbes Park, Las Marinas, like also have these minimum lot size and floor area ratio requirements, which effectively means only really, really high income people can live there. Okay. Now, what does this mean? Beverly Hills residents therefore pay taxes, and these taxes support their local high school, which is a public high school. Okay? And this is Beverly Hills High School. But the only ones who go there are children in Beverly Hills, and they're all high income. Okay? So Beverly Hills High School may be a public school. Everyone there is from the high income families. Okay? So that's why in the United States of America and Canada, given its history, um, going to a public school is not automatically a social status mark. It will really depend on the city, on the state. You have to know what's are. Okay? This is one of the things about economics, especially when you talk about training in economics. Until my time, actually before my time, in order to complete a PhD in economics, in addition to their usual micro and macroeconomic theory, your mathematics, statistics, and the beginnings of econometrics. Okay. Those who want to take a PhD in economics were required to study one or two courses in economic history, which from the 1980s was no longer required. Somehow, one of my professors, professor economic develop in history of economics and also economic development, another professor suggested, why don't I study economic history? Because the theories are theories, neoclassical theories are neoclassical theories, but with economic history, that's the study of what really happened. Okay, and it would therefore broaden your to understand the association, which is why if you largely stick to neoclassical economic analysis, you would fail to appreciate some of these aspects of how things change over time and how certain things happen in different countries because neoclassical economics in terms of theory and its econometric methodology tend to develop approaches which show the commonalities among different economies. But it's only when one takes up economic history that one can make an appreciation of differences among countries and how they change over time. Yeah, that's why I encourage you to take up economic history. Now, economic history has become a separate field in history. Okay? And that's why there are now economic historians. These are people who have to study the economics, but at the same time, they have to study historical research methods, which unfortunately are not taught to economics majors. But anyway, that's just food for thought. So this is a New World Society. So a New World Society, being a dominantly immigrant society, they have high rates of savings. And that's why they can move to the next stage, the stage of preconditions being set, because these societies are able to generate savings that will allow for funds being collected by the local governments in order to pay for the transport system and the elementary educational system as a starting point. And over time, of course, one of the characteristics of countries that are attaining the higher stages of economic development is that they keep on expanding the transport system and begin covering other infrastructure. And at the same time, they begin to expand the educational systems to go beyond the elementary towards the secondary all the way up to the tertiary and postgraduate and further research activities. So this is the New World Society. Now let's look at the Old World Society. The Old World Society, okay, is based upon the experience of the Western European countries. Now, Old World societies are societies with dense population. They have high population density and they already have urban areas. Okay, by 1700s, you do have major cities like London and Paris, in Amsterdam, Hamburg, Vienna. In contrast, in North America, New York, Toronto, Boston, they were small, very small cities. Yeah, at that time, very small. There wasn't a large population in these places. Okay, the population of these North American countries would expand rapidly from the 1800s onwards, with more and more immigrants coming from Western Europe. Okay. As of the 1700s, they're very, very small cities. In contrast to Europe, they have large cities. Okay, okay. Paris, London, Amsterdam, Hamburg, okay, Vienna, and these are settled communities. Settled communities meaning to say that the population here in these countries have been there for centuries. In contrast to the New World, the population is largely comprised of immigrants. Here, in old world societies, they are settled communities. They've been there for centuries. The characteristic of settled communities is that they do have social classes and there is a good deal of social class stratification. You'd have the aristocracy, what the Europeans call middle classes, and you have the peasants and laborers, okay, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Meanwhile, in the New World societies, if they are specialized in the production and export of agricultural commodities and raw materials and the like, for old world societies, they do have their agricultural systems in place, but they already have manufacturing activities. Manufacturing is largely located in urban areas. It's a largely urban activity. And manufacturing at the time was still literally manufacture. The literal meaning of manufacture is handmade. They are what we would nowadays call uh, cottage industry type. So those that were engaged in the production of textiles, fabrics, clothing, they're all weaving industries, everything was still hand. Okay. Also the production of furniture, sorry, furniture, home furnishings, and the like, all of these still handmade. And the bulk, all of these activities are happening to urban areas. Okay. Of course, the rural areas are largely into agriculture. And then these old world societies already have national governments or central governments. Okay. In contrast, in the United States of America, they'll establish their federal government only with their 1789 constitution. In Canada, they would establish their federal government much later, 1848, 50. And their local government still retained a lot of powers and responsibilities. In contrast, in Europe, you do have national governance in place. Okay. Now, when you look at the different social classes, okay, the aristocracy owned landed estates, and they're the ones that maintain control over government. Okay. They're able to get taxes collected, and clearly, since they're the ones running government, they don't tax themselves. They tax other sectors of society, which is I will show to you why they were taxing the middle classes, the business people. Now, aristocrats own landed estates. These estates are engaged in farming. Much of the activity of farming is done by peasant households, where peasant households are households whose primary agricultural activity is directed to the production of their own consumption needs. So a peasant household is not a profit-oriented household primarily. The peasant household grows food and makes their own clothing. So it allows them, therefore, to raise their own families. And they're able to do this by settling on the estate of an aristocrat. Okay? So, by settling in the estate of the aristocrat, they are allowed to raise their own families. They can grow their own food, build their own houses, raise their own families. Okay? But in return, okay, they maintain a personal relationship with their Lord in that they can ask help from the Lord. At the same time, they pay their rents to the Lord. The rent can be in the form of cash or it can be in the form of a commodity. Peasant households would have to be engaged in addition to production for their own subsistence. They have to be engaged in the production of some commodity that can be sold for cash, either the peasants selling it and then paying the rent, or the peasants sending the commodities to the lord's household, and then the lord then able to sell it. So in this way, they pay their rent to the lords, and the aristocrats are able to gather their earnings, which are rentals of the estates. Now, given that it is a labor-intensive society, the more peasants there are, then the greater the output and the greater the rental incomes, which is why aristocrats have to attract as many peasants as they could in order to settle in their estates and at the same time generate more rental earnings. Okay? Aristocrats are in control of the government, so therefore their earnings are utilized for political purposes. Okay? For political purposes. And among the important political purposes is that they have to show off their wealth and power. By showing off their wealth and power, they're able to attract more peasants to settle in their estates. By showing off their wealth and power, they're able to project their ability to run government, either be part of the national government or be responsible for the local community. And also, they're able to project their wealth and power. And through this, they're therefore able to form alliances with other aristocrats. Okay? They form political alliances with aristocrats in order to strengthen their hold on government. And of course, the most effective form of an alliance would be marriage alliances. So aristocrats tend to arrange marriages, okay, among themselves. The purpose of the marriage being to strengthen the position of the aristocrats. Both sides are contracting the marriage. Okay, and that's why it's traditional in European societies that marriages among aristocrats seldom is romantic, seldom does it involve love. It's arranged in order to strengthen alliances among families, and the purpose is to bring forth the next generation of children who can then inherit the estates and inherit the alliances among the families. Okay, they could have their mistresses and lovers. That was an accepted fact, since aristocratic marriages were never meant towards romance. Okay? The important thing, though, about your mistresses and your lovers is that, especially for women, they're not supposed to bring forth illegitimate children. But otherwise, they can proceed with the like. So if you look closely at the aristocracy, they have secure earnings, their collection of rental incomes. And the fact is, it's necessary for them to engage in high levels of consumption and conspicuous consumption to advertise their wealth and power. And that's why aristocrats tend to have large palatial residences. These residences are meant to gather people, attract other aristocrats, and or attract their peasants. So there are lots of stories of in these palaces where the peasants gather for a party hosted by their lord. Okay? You could see this in for those of you who are fans of British historical drama and comedy. You can see this in the series Downton Abbey, okay, where you have the lord's family maintaining high rates of consumption, and among other things, they have a large domestic staff, okay, who are well paid. Okay, so which is why if you look at the aristocrats, they need to have large palatial residences and all the expensive home furnishings and fittings to show off their wealth and power. And they could also have the latest gadgetry. So therefore, if you look at the aristocrats don't have no incentive to save. They have secure source of earnings, the rental incomes, and they're in government, they can enforce payment. And it's of necessity that they show off their wealth and power, so they have to have high levels of consumption. In contrast, you now have the middle classes. Middle class in Europe is quite different from how we in the Philippines define middle class. We tend to define middle class the way the North Americans do, which is middle income households. Okay? Middle classes in Europe are not necessarily middle income. When for example, the family of the Duchess of Cambridge, the Middletons, are referred to always as a middle class family, middle class. They actually are quite wealthy. They're millionaires. They have a very, very successful business of producing and selling uh, party items. Alam niyo, the British, when they have a party, they like to have all sorts of trimmings. So they might want to have some paper hats. There would be a theme. Like for Christmas, there will be paper hats. There would be Father Christmases. That's how they call Santa Claus, Father Christmas puppets, and the like. Or if it's a birthday, their children's birthday, there will be balloons, and that's the business of family. So they are wealthy. They are millionaires. They have very high incomes, but they're called middle class because middle class meant that they were not aristocrats, but they were not the lower classes. They're not the peasants and laborers, which I'll discuss later. Okay. Middle classes were merchants, artisans, and manufacturers. These are the business people. Okay. So in Europe, when they say, oh, you have a very uh, middle class attitude, okay, it's the attitude of people who are in business. Okay, mostly merchants, artisans, and manufacturers. These people are the ones that manufacture and sell goods. And they also bring in imported items. The merchants are the ones that bring in a lot of imported items. And their main markets were the aristocratic households. Okay? So it's the aristocratic households that patronize them for the clothing, the home furnishings, the furniture, and the kitchen utensils and gadgetry, and these merchants are those that also bring those imported goods which were very, very expensive. So being able to obtain them would mean showing off their wealth and power. They present things like silks and porcelains and porcelains and dyes, dyes for clothing and the like. Okay, and there may markets where that of the aristocratic households. Okay, mm. In Europe, the most common fabric is wool, and the most expensive dye in Europe was red dye because this red dye comes from the Middle East. And so a marker of great wealth at the time would be to have a red carpet. Carpets are made of wool, and in Europe, you know that many of the stone houses are cold, so what keeps them warm would be to have carpets, and that's why carpets are common in Western Europe. This is in contrast to China. In China, Japan, most houses were made of wood, and wood is already an insulate. Okay? It keeps the interior warm during winter and cool during summer. Okay? And they're able to have a lot of their houses, even the imperial palaces in China, Beijing, like the Forbidden City, they're largely made of wood because China was able to develop um, the technology of having sharp, very, very sharp blades and like much earlier than Europe did. And that's why they can fell a lot of wood. And wood became the material of choice for houses there because it's a good insulator. Europe did have forests, but they were not able to develop those bladed instruments, which is why they therefore tended to have their houses made of stone. And to keep these houses well insulated, they have carpets. Okay? And a sure sign of wealth would be when the carpets are red. So you have the red carpet treatment. Okay? And that's because the red dye is very expensive. It's imported all the way from the Middle East. In contrast, in China, their most common fabric was silk, and the most expensive silk was yellow, and that for a long time that was reserved for the emperor. Yellow was the color of the emperor because yellow silk was the most expensive. The dye for yellow silk came all the way from India. Okay. So in Europe, therefore, you have the emergence of the notion known as the red carpet treatment. Okay. And for a long, long time, red carpets were always the sorts of carpets for kings and queens, which is why we still have them up to today. Okay. Whenever you have state occasions and the president is present, there's always a red carpet. Okay, tas ginaya na yan sa Hollywood and the like, red carpet. But that's the origin of red carpets. Okay. It's also the reason why in Western Europe, red is the traditional color of royal families. The traditional color of kings and queens was red because precisely of the association with red wool, red dyed wool, which is the most expensive type of wool. In contrast to China, where yellow was the imperial color because yellow dyed silk was the most expensive. So, okay. So this would be the nature of the social classes in Europe. Now, the middle classes were business people engaged in manufacturing, trade, and the like. And as such, for them to survive and thrive, they needed to have and maintain high rates of savings. Okay? And the high rates of savings did not mean that they would invest in bank deposits. There were not very many banks yet, but there already were. But for many middle classes, they do um, set up bank accounts and bought financial assets. But the bulk of their savings involved reinvestment in the business. So they're the ones that reinvested their profits in the business and they would reinvest in improving their products, their processes, and the like. So the middle classes were the ones with high rates of savings. Okay. And also they had no incentive towards high levels of consumption, whether conspicuous or not, because for them to thrive and survive, they needed to keep on reinvesting their earnings. Finally, you have the peasants and laborers. The peasants, as I mentioned to you, were the ones paying rent to the lordly estates. Okay? They pay rent by way of the earnings when they sell some product that uh, has a market. Like they would be harvesting and selling wool or wheat, barley, grains, and other such grains used for food and also for alcoholic beverages, okay, wool for the making of clothing and the like. Or these products they send to the Lord's household who then sell it and it becomes the rental income. Okay. And then you also have the laborers. Laborers are paid a wage. They usually are in the cities and towns, and they are hired by the business people, okay, with low wages as always. So the peasants and laborers, therefore, are the ones that are able to produce, do the actual production of agricultural commodities and manufactured goods, but they have very, very low earnings, money earnings and the like. So in the old world society, the main savings come from the middle classes of businessmen, of the merchants, the artisans, and manufacturers. Now, by the analysis of Rostow, something happened in a very, very short period of time, from the late 1700s to the 1800s. Okay. First started in the United Kingdom and spread through the rest of Western Europe. And in this particular process, what would happen is that these middle classes would be able to earn huge profits in a very, very short period of time. Huge profits that allowed them to generate substantial wealth. With the huge profits, they could start buying land, purchasing financial assets, and expanding their businesses further, which meant that in that short period of time, these middle classes began to be the dominant social class. Dominant that they were able to gradually take over the running of government from the aristocrats. Okay. And since previously the government would impose taxes on the business people, the middle classes and the like, okay, with the middle classes now able to start controlling government, they were now able to impose taxes on the aristocrats as well. So with these middle classes becoming the dominant class in society, okay, with their control over government, they were able to get government to start to spend on expanding the transport system and start setting up the elementary education system. Okay. And that's why in many Western European countries, okay, government schools, okay, like here in the Philippines, uh, tend to educate children coming from lower income households. In contrast, even before, uh, the aristocrats and some of the very wealthy middle classes, okay, paid to send their children, first sons, later daughters, paid to send their children to school for them to get an education. So therefore, these were fee-paying private educational institutions, which has remained that way. Okay? Private schools, again, tend to educate children from the higher income classes. The government-run schools tend to educate children from the lower income classes. And that's the origin of this difference. Okay. So through this, the high rates of savings become the dominant sort of behavior in society because now it is these middle classes that became the dominant uh, social class in society. Okay? So that even the aristocrats had to change their behavior and they started to be engaged as well in higher rates of savings because they've lost complete control over government. They now have to pay their taxes. And conspicuous consumption also lost its logic, as I'll discuss later. The point here is that the middle classes became the new elite, okay? With the middle classes becoming the new elite, okay? They were able to challenge successfully the dominance of the aristocrats and they became dominant uh, throughout society, which is why many of the aristocrats have had to convert their palaces and their estates into profit-oriented establishments, which is why in Europe, many of these grand old palatial houses, many of them have been turned into hotels or conference venues, conference centers, and the like, or the aristocrats would still be living there, but they've had to open them up as museums to allow people to come in, pay fees, and the like, because the aristocrats no longer needed, nor could they afford to engage in conspicuous consumption, and they've lost their control over government. Because what happened was, with these middle classes becoming more and more dominant, they expanded their businesses so much so that they were able to create more and more job opportunities. And many of the job opportunities were taken up by those coming from peasant families. So more and more of peasant families were moving to towns and cities in search for jobs, which meant that there were lesser and lesser peasants in the landed estates of the aristocrats. And with lesser and lesser peasants, that would mean lesser and lesser rental incomes for the aristocrats. And that's why they began to lose their dominance in society. And since they've begun to gradually lose control over government, they no longer needed to show off their wealth and power to attract more peasants on their estates, or for that matter, to attract alliances. Okay, so that's why they have begun to scale down on their consumption efforts and convert their estates in profitable enterprises, profit-oriented enterprises. So they ended up having high rates of savings too, especially since they now have to pay taxes. Okay? So the new elite, therefore, their values of hard work, high rates of savings, and investment of earnings now became dominant throughout society. So that even for many of those who were laborers, peasants, many of them started to adopt this behavior, many engaging in entrepreneurial activities and they themselves becoming successful business people. But the important thing now to look at is based upon Rostov's analysis, what really happened in that very short period of time from the late 1700s to the 1800s that allowed these middle classes to accumulate so much wealth that they ended up being able to gradually and successfully challenge the aristocrats. Okay, there were four major processes here. Okay? In all these processes, the net result was that in a very, very short period of time, it substantially increased the earnings of the business classes. And therefore, with this huge increase in their earnings in a very short period of time, it allowed them to accumulate a lot of wealth, especially since by their nature, they're high savers. Their earnings, they keep on reinvesting. So they're able to accumulate substantial wealth in a very short period of time that allowed them to challenge the dominance of the aristocrats. And these are the four processes which Rostow argued can be replicated among developing countries. Okay. The first is capital inflow. Okay. The Industrial Revolution was supposed to have begun sometime in the late 1700s with those widespread technical achievements, inventions, and the like. Um, but also a major event, political event happened in the late 1700s, dated from 1789, was the French Revolution. Okay? And the French Revolution would later on expand towards the Napoleonic Wars, where armies led by Napoleon Bonaparte began to invade a lot of the continental European countries, from Portugal and Spain all the way to Russia. Okay? And France was able to occupy Italy, Germany, the German states, Austria, Hungary, and all those countries, and the like. Okay? The Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte in Waterloo and his exile to St. Helena. Okay, now those are about 21 years, this political the thing, 26 years. Okay. The thing about this era was this. The United Kingdom was the one major European power that Napoleon could not invade. So what happened was that the aristocrats throughout Europe, continental Europe, sent their funds to London for safekeeping, especially given the threat of invasion from the Napoleonic forces, the French forces. Okay. Many of the aristocrats of continental Europe sent their funds to London for safekeeping. I'll discuss later when we talk about capital and finance how by the 1700s, a banking system among several countries in Europe made it quite possible to transfer funds from one country to another in a very short period of time. But anyway, at the time, a lot of the aristocrats throughout Europe sent their funds to London for safety. The result was the substantial decrease in interest rates in the London financial market. low interest rates that allowed for the expansion of businesses in the United Kingdom that who could now benefit from low cost interest, okay, cheap loans and the like, and therefore allowed them to expand their businesses in a very short period of time. Okay. And this is the origin of London becoming the world's largest international financial center. It still is up to today. The largest financial centers are New York City and Tokyo, Shanghai and Hong Kong coming very closely. London is the third largest. However, in terms of transactions, the bulk of transactions in London are international in nature, like a Russian bank lending to a Swedish business and the like. Unlike in New York, in Tokyo, the bulk of their transactions were domestic banks lending to domestic firms. In London, it was international. It had its origins during this time. London emerged as the major global international financial center, which is why for those of you who are in international finance issues, you know that to this day, the benchmark international interest rate is still the LIBOR or the London Interbank Offered Rate, the interest rate charged on loans in the London Financial Center, which is quoted on a daily basis. Okay. So this capital inflow, therefore, allowed for the rapid expansion of businesses throughout the United Kingdom. And with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, British banks then could provide low interest loans to businesses throughout Europe. Okay, so here, in a very short period of time, you have rapid expansion of businesses because they now have access to low interest loans. Then, as I mentioned to you, in the late 1700s, you have the emergence of these new technologies. Okay, and the effect of these new technologies, again, was that in a very short period of time, it substantially reduced per unit cost of production. It increased production in a very short period of time. And therefore, with the increased production, you have the decrease in per unit production costs, which would result in greater profits for the businesses. Okay? You have the development here of the steam engine that allowed for the mechanization first of the manufacture of textiles and then of clothing. So in a very short period of time, you have large scale production being made possible by these new technologies. And then you have the new technologies in steel production, which allowed for greater production of iron and steel products and the like. So the development of new technologies resulted in greater revenues and lower cost of production. Okay. But a third and closely related event is the discovery of new markets. Okay. By the 1800s, much of the world has already been known and explored throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America. But in the 1800s, late 1700s and 1800s, what has happened was that the development of the steam engine, okay, now allowed for faster transport. Okay, it took Christopher Columbus about 2 to 2.5 months to cross the Atlantic. By the emergence of the steam engine in the 1800s, okay, the travel time from England to New York was reduced to just 1 week. So imagine from 2.5 months to 1 week, which means that in 2.5 months, ships can go back and forth at least 4 to 5 times. And therefore, they would be able to bring a much bigger volume of goods and people back and forth. Okay? And that would be the same towards the other markets in Europe, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And among other things, they discovered that in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there were markets. There were landed aristocrats there too, and also merchants and businessmen there too. Okay? Which meant that these people could be a market for a lot of the goods being manufactured and produced in Europe. And the goods can easily reach them because of the more rapid transport system. So with this discovery of new markets, again, the increased production brought about by the development of new technologies and the lower interest rate loans brought about by capital inflow meant that there are now more revenues that can actually be generated because they can really further increase production in Europe because they can send and export their goods to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they could also extend loans to the landed aristocrats and the merchants in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, extend loans for them to produce goods, usually agricultural commodities, that have a market in Western Europe. Okay? So with the increased earnings of the landed aristocrats and businessmen in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, brought about by their exporting goods to Europe, now with their increased earnings, they can now buy a lot of the manufactured goods which were being produced and exported by British and later the Western European manufacturers. So in this sense, you now have a global trading system. There was already a global trading system before, but this was rapidly expanded by the development of transport technology in the 1800s. So with this, you now have greater revenues and earnings by the business classes, first in Britain and then in the rest of Europe. This entire global process I'll be discussing in greater detail later when we talk about capital and finance and trade. So in capital inflow, development of new technologies, and the discovery of new markets, you have in a very short period of time huge earnings by the business classes, the manufacturers and merchants of Britain and later on in the rest of Western Europe that allowed them to successfully and gradually challenge the dominance of the aristocrats. And that's why the high savings attitudes and way of life became dominant in the Western European societies, supplanting the values and attitudes of the aristocrats. Okay. And then you perceived external adversity. Okay. Now, one way of explaining this is that when you talk about perceived external adversity, you're talking here about the experience of being under some form of threat to one's existence, which therefore means that it would encourage people to maintain high rates of savings and not engage in too much consumption so that they could have funds necessary in case some form of threat actually materializes. Okay. And though the threat does not materialize, given this behavior, it allowed for greater and greater accumulation of wealth. So it reaches the point that these people would have earned a lot of wealth. Okay. This is supposed to explain the dominance of the Jews in Western European finance and business. Okay, they had high rates of savings because of this perceived threat to their existence as a class of people. But it said that it also explains why the European countries progressed more rapidly, way ahead of China, even though China had developed a lot of technologies ahead of Europe. The idea being that the European countries saw each other as in competition with each other, so that their leadership, both government and the businesses, tended to focus on, yes, improving their technologies and accumulating greater and greater savings and wealth for themselves. And that's why, with this sense of competition among the European countries, he had greater and greater focus on saving and investment in order to strengthen their individual businesses within their own individual countries. So you have therefore the result of greater savings, greater earnings among the European countries, and therefore the emergence of the business classes as the new elite. Okay, so this is the explanation given by the stages of growth theory to explain the process of economic development as it happened in Europe and North America. It can then be um, applied to developing countries. Many developing countries are also called countries in transition. Okay? President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, for example, always made reference to the Philippines as an economy in transition. In transition, meaning to say that we're no longer a traditional society. We no longer have, we're no longer an old world society. We've gone beyond that. When it comes to preconditions set, we've also gone beyond that. We have set up more than just the elementary education system. And it's not just the transport system, but the other infrastructure have been put in place. It may be inadequate in general, but it's already present. We have not just the transport system, but the communications, energy systems, and like things which I'll be discussing in the next topic. Okay. The savings rate of the country has gone beyond 10%. We've been reaching 18% since the 1990s. Okay. But in terms of drive to maturity, the industrial sector comprises the bulk of the total value of our output and exports, but not yet of total employment. So that's why we have not yet reached the stage of high mass consumption. That's why we are still classified as being a country in transition. So, for purposes therefore of long-term economic growth, it does suggest that immigration would have to be encouraged, okay? Because immigrants, by their nature, are more risk-taking individuals. They're willing to take risks to move to another country or another place and therefore work hard and have high rates of savings. And these high rates of savings will translate to greater savings for the entire country, the entire society. And that's why it is said that migration has to be encouraged. Both cases of Filipinos emigrating elsewhere and also being open to immigrants from other countries coming here to settle. Because when they settle here, they would be the ones with high rates of savings. Okay? It also means encouraging domestic migration because migrants do have high rates of savings too, even though they just migrated within the country. So it would involve encouraging more and more people to migrate to the cities. Hopefully, we hope not just to Metro Manila, other cities like Cebu, Iloilo, Davao, and like. Okay. Now, it would also suggest that we would allow for greater inflows and outflows of capital by way of more liberalized policies on foreign investment, foreign debt, and the like, because with more liberal capital flows going in and outside of the country, it can assure lower interest rates. and therefore a cheap source of loanable funds. Yeah. It would also suggest that developing countries would also emphasize the development of new technologies, either directly investing in new technologies or, as we discussed in neoclassical theories, spending on the adaptation of existing technologies, okay, with the end in view of improving production efficiencies and increasing output at lower per unit cost. And discovery of new markets would mean greater engagement in trade. Okay. So by engagement in trade, it would mean that domestic producers would have a larger global market to send their exports, purchase their inputs, and the like. And finally, in terms of perceived external adversity, it could explain why some countries progressed faster than others. Okay, with South Korea feeling itself under threat from North Korea, Taiwan and Hong Kong under threat from China, Singapore under threat from Malaysia and Indonesia. That's why they said these countries develop rapidly. In contrast, here in the Philippines, we do not really perceive any major external threat. That's why we tend to fight each other. And therefore, that could explain to some degree why we have not progressed as rapidly as the others. The extent of the stimulus or investment towards focusing on saving and investment is not there. Okay? Something else would have to stimulate the society in order to focus on greater saving and investment to raise standards of living. Perceived external adversity might not be that, perhaps all the others do, allowing for free flow of capital, development of new technologies, and engaging in trade, free trade, and encouraging migration. All right, so this is the stages of growth theory. Our next topic would be to look at structural theories, where structural theories focus on analyzing what is called the structure of an economic system, the structure defined in sociology as the non-visible elements of an economic system. So that by looking at the structure of an economy, one can identify if that country is a developed economy by the structure of its economy, or if it's a developing economy. And that is what we'll be discussing in our next class. So as of the moment, are there any questions or comments or any clarifications that you might have? Okay. So if there are none, of course, you can always send me an email. I prefer on Canvas, but you can also send the email through my official email account. If there's some questions or comments that you need to call my attention to. And if I will need to discuss that with the entire class later, I would. Okay, so if there are no more questions and comments, as always, I'll be posting the link to the recording, and I would urge you to please download it as soon as possible. What I've been doing is that I have been posting the video recording on YouTube. Okay, so eventually I'll also post that so that you can also access the videos for purposes of your own. Okay. So, all right. So if there are no more questions or comments coming from any of you, I'll bid you all good night. Thank you very much for your patience, and I will see you next week. I can never get which if I should turn left or right because of the peculiarity of the recording. So, good evening and good night. I'll see you all next week. Okay, bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you
Thank you,
po.
sir.
I'll see you next week.